Thank you so much, Emma. It's lovely to see so many faces of old friends here. Wonderful. I keep spotting more. One, terrific. And a delight to be here today speaking at this Per Capita event. Thank you so much for the invitation, Per Capita, to do that at today's John Cain Lunch. And I'd like to associate myself with Emma's acknowledgement of the Wurundjeri people, and also add my own to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose country I live and work in Canberra. Well, the two John Cains feature in Dreamers and Schemers, and in relation to them, I hope that the book indicates why we need to consider political history in the long run, which is what this book tries to do in grappling with their particular experience and legacy. I'll find them here, hopefully. Oops. Right arrow? Sorry. Moving along. There you go.
Got it.
That's right. Right. There they are. Now, look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin self-indulgently by reading you just a brief passage on each. So here's a passage on John Cain Sr. It's in the chapter on World War II. With its heavy industry, Victoria was integral to the war effort, but you wouldn't have known it from a glance at its state politics. An electoral system that greatly magnified the power of the bush kept the country party's Albert Dunstan in power until 1942, when Labor decided finally to pull the plug on his indolent minority government. John Cain, the Labor leader, was a product of the old Victorian Socialist Party, the radical milieu shaped by English socialist Tom Mann, that had also helped form Curtin's politics, John Curtin. His origins were humble. Cain had begun his working life as a farm boy and had little formal education. A man of wide sympathies and a friend of Menzies, Cain drew the line at the devious and opportunistic Dunstan, who believed in socialism for farmers, that is, generous support at the expense of taxpayers and consumers, and stinginess for everyone else. Spending on health, education and social services stagnated. Cain resented that he had to wear the opprobrium of keeping him in power for want of any better alternative. But Dunstan's opposition to the Curtin government's uniform taxation legislation finally provided an escape hatch in 1942, and what the political scientist A.F. Davies called the beginning of the end of this baroque period of Victorian politics. Cain withdrew his party support and moved to the opposition benches, leaving the government dependent on the UAP votes in Parliament. The Victorian Labor Party, like its counterpart in New South Wales, was divided. In this instance, a fiercely anti-communist executive in which Catholic influence was strong wrestled with the party's left. Religious sectarianism was rising. The formation of the movement in Melbourne in 1942 gave a further edge to these traditional left-right rivalries. Cain, with his decades of political experience, was a famously shrewd politician who had many of the same gifts as his old comrade Curtin for keeping such people in the same tent, which he combined with the calm demeanour of a shifley. He managed 4 days as Premier in September 1943, when Labor combined briefly with the UAP to throw Dunstan out. But Cain's achievement was to turn Labor into a credible government. To get there, he commenced a dialogue with the UAP leader Tom Holway, a cultivated Liberal in the Deaconite tradition. After an election late in 1945, held on new electoral boundaries, Cain was able to form a minority government that would last until 1947. The former nationalist parliamentarian, Fred Eggleston, said of it, "Most people will agree that Cain's government was the best that had been in office for years." So that's, I think, the most concentrated passage I have on John Cain Sr. I'd say there are a number of the contexts in the book that are necessary for understanding his career. The radical culture of early Labor and socialist movement in Australia between the 1890s and the First World War, the electoral weakness of the Victorian Labor Party, shaped to some extent by the nature of an electoral system that magnified the value of country votes, the kaleidoscopic nature of the party system, which failed to conform to the two sides model that emerged in all other states. I don't think there's a realisation that Victoria didn't really have a two-party system You could argue in some ways until the late 1980s, because remember, the Bolte government was a Liberal government, not a coalition government. So, you know, a very unusual party system, the rise of the movement, the industrial groups, and the devastating impact on factional rivalries in Victoria in the 1940s and 50s, the role of Chifley's bank nationalisation and the wider anti-Labor mobilisation of the late 40s in destroying that government that I just referred to, the 1945 to 7 government, and of course the impact of the Labor split of 54-55. Now let me read you a much shorter passage on John Cain Jr. Where are we? There we go. The most anti-nuclear state government was that of John Cain in Victoria. But Cain exuded the image of a prudent suburban solicitor that he had been before he elected to Parliament. Unassuming and incorruptible, he had strong personal reasons for wishing to reassure the public that Labor could provide a solid, competent and reforming government. The only previous majority Labor government was that of his father, elected 30 years before. The younger Cain belonged to the small participants group in the 1960s that played a critical role in the reform of the branch, and he remained unaligned with either the right, Labor Unity, or the socialist left, which was the dominant faction in Victoria. Ancient hatred still lay beneath the party's veneer of harmony as it went about governing the state. When the 1985 party conference faced the question of admitting formerly DLP-aligned unions that would strengthen the position of the right, angry opponents sprayed insults, fists and tomatoes as they purged themselves of 30 years' hostility to the strains of the last post on a clarinet played by an official from the musicians' union. It was like 1955 all over again, minus the fedora hats and Gladstone bags. And on it goes. I won't continue because I'm going to talk a little bit more about John Cain Jr. in a moment. So I hope the dreamers and schemers will contextualise John Cain Jr.'s career too. Again, the long-term electoral weakness of Labor in Victoria was a factor. It seems almost incredible now, doesn't it, to talk about the long-term electoral weakness of Labor in Victoria, and I'll come to that in a moment. If your ambition was to be in government in Victoria, John Cain Jr. reflected in an account of his own government, the Labor Party was not the place to be. In state politics, Victoria had long been Labor's wasteland, with only occasional minority governments limping through periods of turbulence before falling over in the face of external and internal pressures. And of course, the only majority government before John Cain's in 1982 was John Cain's back in 1952. Now, the respective places in Australian political history of the majority governments of the two John Cains was starkly different. John Cain Sr.'s government would not even manage a full term, a victim of the Labor split, which of course was very much centred on Victoria. That defeat began 27 years in the political wilderness. The victory of the Labor Party, led by John Cain Jr., was by way of contrast one of 3 in a row. Labor would govern for more than a decade, but it also inaugurated a fundamental shift in the state's electoral politics. Since that time, as I'm sure everyone in this room is well and truly aware, Labor has governed Victoria for all but a dozen years. Its opponents have managed just 3 terms. We'll see if that statement is still true in a few days. These changes, these remarkable changes really, and a sort of pattern occurred in South Australia, which I won't talk about here, but these changes represent a major political transformation that does not lend itself to easy explanation. Paul Strangio, also happens to be my cousin, has tentatively suggested that the party's unprecedented success in state politics in the last few decades has been indebted to its inheritance and development of the Victorian Liberal tradition. Yeah. Stretching back to the colonial era and to figures such as George Higginbotham, Graham Berry and Alfred Deakin, and of course all feature very prominently in the book. Victoria was a very turbulent place in the nation's politics in the 19th century. 2 severe constitutional crises evoked, I think, in that picture, particularly over on the right, which is of the Victorian Embassy of Graham Berry returning, Victorian Embassy of Graham Berry returning from London in 1879. You can see the scale of the mass politics involved here. Victoria, of course, really spawned the first political parties in Australia in the 1870s. New South Wales didn't really have them till 1887, and that had a lot to do with the polarised nature of political life in Victoria because of the particular way in which the Legislative Council was constituted. It was an elected body, but on a highly restricted franchise and on an extremely restricted set of qualifications for actually being able to join as a member, and that gave the politics a very polarised character. So when the Bracks government finally achieved major Legislative Council reform early this century, Bracks was thoroughly aware that he was, it was one of those moments in time that he was achieving something that had in fact eluded generations and generations, not just of Labor politicians, but also of the radical Liberals of the 19th century, such as Higginbotham in the 1860s and Graham Berry in the 1870s. And I think we can see the modern Labor Party, the post, I guess, 1980 Labor Party, as picking up in many ways that Liberal tradition and developing it in interesting ways. And note too, of course, that at that very moment, the sort of mid to late 1970s, the Liberal Party in this state was lurching to the right. I mean, the key election there was 1976, the one that brought, for instance, Jeff Kennett into the parliament, but also a number of others who really, I guess, didn't identify in quite the same way with the more progressive Liberal tradition, certainly associated in the state with Buchanan. Glimmers and Schemes tells the story of the changes of the 1960s that would culminate in federal intervention in the Victorian branch of the Labor Party in 1970 and 71. And it's timely to consider these at the moment, of course. We're celebrating the election of the Whitlam government early next month. And earlier this year, it's also, of course, 40 years since John Cain Jr. was elected. The 1960s were on the whole dismal years for Labor in Victoria, again reflected in his memoirs. But he, as I've said, was involved with a small group of urban professionals, several of them lawyers, who had a significant role in reforming the Labor Party in this state. They called themselves the Participants. The machine they confronted is a legacy of the 1955 split, dominated by left-wing union officials and their allies. The State Secretary, Bill Hartley, previously Western Australian, was a protege of the formidable bastion of left orthodoxy in that state, F.E. Joe Chamberlain. A trade unionist defence committee ensured that a fairly small group of union leaders exercised a very tight control over pre-selections and administration in Victoria. And there was also a strain of anti-Catholicism in this, fanned by the continuing strength of the Democratic Labor Party in Victoria, as well as the activities of B.A. Santamaria and the National Civic Council who dominated. And there was a taste for conspiracy, perhaps justified. Maybe the conspiracies were sometimes real, but anyway, officials and leaders appeared more preoccupied with threats posed by the DLP and the NCC, and sometimes they seem a bit like an alphabet soup, as I point out in the book, than with the Liberal Party. And I love this quotation. The outgoing state executive member, Tom Doyle, this is about 1969, June 69, thanked the comrades at his last meeting, and he said he hoped that the new executive would take note of the warning signs of the DLP, who are still campaigning actively to bring about the destruction of the Victorian branch. He thanked members for their comradeship and indicated his fervent hope that the branch would continue to act in the principal manner of its record since 1955. You can see there the preoccupation is utterly with the DLP as the enemy. No mention of the Liberal Party. No mention of the Liberal Party. That year, 1969, that year, 1955, and all that flowed from it continued to weigh like a nightmare on the brains of the living into the 1960s and even 70s. At each election defeat, the special problems of the Victorian branch would be cited as the reason for failure. Always special problems. The spoiling role of the DLP and NCC, the concentration of Labor support in the industrial centres of northern and western Melbourne, and the electoral malapportionment in favour of Bush. The young radical and future historian Stuart McIntyre, briefly a Labor Party member in the mid-1960s, recalled attending the party's Carlton branch around that time to hear the local member, Arthur Cleary, tell us that he did not expect to see a Labor government at his time, nor ours either. The party machine disliked dissent and was assiduous in asserting its control. It habitually dismissed critics as tools of the DLP and NCC. Internal critics of the party's authoritarian structures were called before the executive to explain themselves and sometimes expelled. Members who made unauthorised media appearances were subject to discipline. Even senior politicians, such as John Cain, required the executive's permission to appear on TV. Party members who were identified as allies of Gough Whitlam, even after he'd succeeded Arthur Calwell as leader of the Federal Labor Party early in 1967, were frequent Victorian Central Executive targets. Now, John Cain, as I've said, was a member of the participants. He was a lawyer with a flourishing suburban practice, and by no means the central figure in that group. Fellow lawyers such as Dick McGarvey and John Button were more active, but Cain was openly associated with the participants and its newsletter Labor Comment, a publication that deeply annoyed the party machine and to whose editorial board Cain belonged. Cain, as a member of the Reservoir branch, was identified in November 1967 as an ALP member available to speak at branch meetings. The topics he favoured were foreign affairs, federal organisation and injustices in the tax system. In May 1969, Cain, now chairman of the participants along with his deputy, published a statement on behalf of Labor Comment condemning the VCE for having recently expelled 3 Labor members who were internal critics. They supported, Cain that is, and his colleagues supported an ALP that was, and I quote, progressive and enlightened and standing on a broad base of democratic socialism, a party that is concerned about the welfare of the great majority of the people. It needed to be conducted as a political party capable of government, not, as the party was presently run, a narrow section pressure group more concerned with running marches, protests and demonstrations than winning political office. You can see all the ways in which that echoes the kinds of things Whitlam was saying nationally at the same time. You can see why there was such a natural simpatico, I guess, between the participants and Whitlam. The participants, in fact, form a bridge, I'd argue, between that older Victorian liberal tradition that I was talking about and Whitlamite social democracy of the 1970s. So in 70 and 71, in the wake of Whitlam's near miss in the 1969 election, that was widely blamed on the party's inability to win seats in Victoria, the federal executive intervened in the Victorian branch, established a new constitution. It applied proportional voting that required the dominant left faction to share power with other groups. And I think this moment is widely seen as a precondition, whether accurately or not, we can't ever know really, for the election of the Whitlam government in 1972. But it was equally so, I think, for Cain's government a decade later. I mean, it was also, I think, essential for that. And of course, in 1976, John Cain was elected a member, or as the member for Bundoora. He once said, I was in this building actually, talking about the fact I went to school at Parade College, Christian Brothers College in Bundoora, and John said, they were very wise in their property investments out there, you know. And in 1981, he succeeded Frank Wilkes as leader of the Labor Party. Now, the Cain government would, in many ways, extend the progressivism of the 60s and 70s associated with names such as Don Dunstan, Gough Whitlam, but also, I think, Victorian Liberal Premier Dick Haymer, extending that into the 1980s. Cain's was a Keynesian government in an age of economic rationalism. It was anti-nuclear in an era of increasingly intense Cold War rivalry. Cain himself was cautious, unassuming and incorruptible, as I said in the book, in an age of extravagance and flamboyance, the fabled 1980s. His government advanced a cosmopolitan image in an era of rising nationalism, and John Neuhausen's here to be able to attest to that firsthand. It championed the environment, the arts, social justice and women's rights, and believed that the progressive educational ideas that had flourished in the 1970s had a part to play in the school system. Cain's government would fall a victim to factional division, industrial conflict and financial problems, and in that, in key respects, recalled his father's downfall a few decades before. But there's a difference, of course. The younger John Cain's legacy would be different. Cain's was a radically liberal government, small l, that heralded the political transformation of Victoria into the Australian Labor Party's jewel in the crown, a term, of course, once used for the Liberals here. So Dreamers and Schemers is about the wider patterns of Australian politics, beginning with pre-contact Indigenous societies 50 to 65,000 years ago, and ending in a frenzied revision to the manuscript with the federal election of 2022. I don't want those 2 weekends that happened to be on. I enjoyed the weekend of the election, but not what I had to do afterwards. it's a book really in a lot of ways also about the spaces and opportunities that our system of government has sometimes inadvertently opened up to various types of participation. Now, I don't want to sound too rosy about this, but, you know, I do talk about the way in which Indigenous politics or Indigenous people have been able to draw on their own traditions of self-government to find those spaces for participation in self-government. And a classic example of this is the heroic struggle to keep land at Corranderk in Victoria in the 1860s, 1870s and 1880s. The figure like William Bracknell, I guess, is very much a part of our political history. So that's one example of it. But also the Chinese vote there in 1880. There's a similar story. The system wasn't designed to facilitate the participation of Chinese voters in Victoria, but there they are. And I talk in the book about their participation in both municipal and colonial elections. And I'd argue that, you know, the federal election that we saw recently, it has a historical hinterland, and it's only comprehensible, I think, if we look at the political history in the long term. There are some of the ways, I think, in which that election was significant. I won't go into that in great detail. I'll just keep that up there. You'll think of your own. But it seems to me each and every one of these developments has a historical hinterland that helps us to make sense of what was going on at that election. And more generally, I think we need a historical understanding of the complicated combination of factors that's brought us to this particular moment with all of its dangers and opportunities. Why women and young voters seemingly so disaffected with the coalition, but perhaps also more generally with the political system itself. Why do major parties that once between them, you know, usually shared over 90% of the vote, now attract only 2/3 of it? Okay, what are the particular, if you like, economic, social and political factors that have contributed to those sorts of patterns? So the basic idea behind the book is that we need a long and wide lens if we're to understand our politics. I mean, it was startling recently to read a piece by a journalist discussing Victorian politics who seemed to think it had historically been a place of Labor Party strength. I think that's what we're dealing with here. There is a fundamental lack of knowledge of those larger patterns. I hope the book will be valuable not only to those who want to know about our political history for its own sake, for the stories and personalities that it yields, but also because it might help explain the way things are now and also the possibilities of our politics. And the latter was always in my mind in writing this book. From the beginning, it asks, you know, what have Australians wanted? What have they asked of their political systems? How have they participated in it? And you know, I've really tried to evoke something of politics on the ground, in the streets, in the halls. And also how well or badly have our political institutions, has our political system responded to people's needs and demands? I mean, it begins with Gough Whitlam's memorial service in 2014. That's how I begin the book, because that occasion became, I believe, one for reflection on what could be accomplished by a visionary in politics, but also what had gone wrong in the 21st century as Australians contemplated the Abbott government, which was in power at that time. As some reviewers have already noted, the book gives an unusual level of attention to state politics in the post-Federation era, continuing, of course, the account of colonial politics in the earlier part of the book. And that was deliberate. It was born of a conviction that state politics has become more important in recent years. The states have become more serious places for political experimentation, whether we're talking charters of rights or treaties with Indigenous people. Some have sought to exercise a major influence on national policy. Recall the third wave reform agenda of the Bracks government, for instance, which I discuss in the book. And with their enhanced borrowing capacity since the mid-1990s, they can also do more. The ambitions of the Andrews government in the building of infrastructure are an obvious and nationally important example. And of course, the pandemic has reminded us of the ways in which state governments remain major influences in the everyday lives of Australians. Just as it has also revealed, you know, some really deeply entrenched and often less positive features of our political culture. Australians have been creative in their politics. They've often drawn on forms and practices from elsewhere, but they've developed a distinctive political culture of their own. In 1930, the historian Keith Hancock, W.K. Hancock, famously presented Australian democracy as having come to look upon the state as a vast public utility whose duty it is to provide the greatest happiness for the greatest number. The citizen, Hancock explained, claimed not natural rights, but rights received from the state and through the state. Collective power was in the service of individual rights so that Australians saw, and I quote, no opposition between individualism and reliance on government. I think it still holds pretty well. The strains were evident during the strains of that culture were evident, I think, during the COVID-19 pandemic, reminding us of their deep embeddedness. Many Australians longed for greater freedom, but most were also willing to agree that there is an individual responsibility for collective welfare and that the state has a role, government has a role in defining where the boundaries lie. There was a broad acceptance, stronger among others, that government should play the predominant role in defining those boundaries. Outside extreme libertarianism, which I think is a minority taste in Australia, people get on with their lives expecting the state to set reasonable parameters for individual behaviour while allowing people a pretty wide scope to pursue their private interests as individuals and families. As Hancock said, collective power at the service of individual rights. Now, is that sufficient? Well, Australian political history has had its dreamers and visionaries alongside its pragmatists and schemers. Okay, now update dreamers and schemers in the book. Big change of the kind that occurred in Australia in the 1850s, the 1890s, the 1940s and the 1980s would have been impossible without the idealists and the thinkers. That is, without political leaders, activists, intellectuals, movements who refused to be merely practical. Change depended on people willing to resist complacent utilitarian appeals to majority interests, to consensus opinion, on the refusal to accept injunctions merely to tinker rather than to transform. In the end, changes depended on vision, a vision, however modest, of what a good life might be. So, look, I hope you enjoy Dreamers and Schemers. I thank you for your interest in the book, and I'd like, again, to repeat my gratitude for the invitation from Per Capita to speak at the John Cain Lunch today. Thank you.
Yes, well, it's always a lively discussion. We do have some people joining us via Zoom, of course, which Meredith will monitor. But who would like to kick us off today?
The comparison between dreamers and schemers. In the dreamers, I would see more charismatic people rather than workers, essentially. So that the good Labour leaders have been charismatic to have brought people along. What's your thoughts in terms of the idea that you don't need a worker, but you need a charismatic person to lead along the way?
Yeah, I think success, thanks for the question, I think successful political reform in this country has usually depended on people being able to combine both. I mean, think of a figure like Whitlam. I've got Race sitting in front of me who knows the story better than almost anyone. I mean, Whitlam was both, surely, wasn't he? Wasn't he a schemer and a dreamer? I mean, he needed to be a schemer to reform the party in the late 60s. He needed to be a schemer. The confrontational resignation in 1968 in taking off on his factional opponents and so on. But, you know, sitting alongside that was the visionary, was the persistent boring away, as Weber would have put it, to articulate a new vision, to formulate policies, to draw on the very best examples and research wherever you found them around the world in formulating policies for Australia in the 1970s. So I think, to my mind, the best political leadership has tended to combine both. The title itself was dreamed up by one of our students, I have to say. We're all sitting there scratching. We call it dreamers and pragmatists. You know, we're going, it's dreamers and schemers. So poor Josh Black, one of our PhD students, has had to kind of bear the burden of having come up with this this title, which of course, as titles often do, came quite late in the piece. There's probably less discussion of both dreamers and schemers explicitly in the book than there ought to be, but it is a book certainly about the different strands, I think, that make for political action and political life, and certainly dreamers and schemers are useful terms in summing some of that up. I'll go to James. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Very, very interesting. This is clearly an ambitious book with a very wide scope on Australian history, Australian political history. How do you, I'm really interested in your process as a historian, how you pull together a book like this, because you could spend 20 years writing this, and you haven't, clearly. So how do you pull together all the information, were there sort of gaps in your knowledge that you knew you had to plug? And you know, what sort of reading do you do to do that? It sounds like you had a research team working with you. Maybe I don't know.
I'll tell you about that. Yeah.
I'm just really interested if you could talk through the work of the historian writing an ambitious political history.
Yeah, thanks, James. Yeah, it's another great question. No, I didn't have a research team. One of my students, Emily Gallagher, who's another PhD student, I did pay to do some research, but very limited. It wasn't supported by grants or anything like that. And most of my books haven't been. I tend to just write them as I go along. Yeah, look, I did. I had a lot of gaps in my knowledge. I don't know what people here know about the early history of the Western Australian Legislative Council, for instance. Well, I didn't. And so, yeah, in I guess trying to achieve that breadth and comprehensiveness, I did have to obviously do a lot of additional reading and research. We're very fortunate, of course, these days. I mean, there's an immense amount of material now available digitally. I went to a book launch in Canberra from one of my old colleagues, a very eminent historian, Alan Atkinson. Recently, he's written a splendid book on John Elizabeth MacArthur, something that he's been reading. You know, he's worked on for 50 years, basically. We've been writing on it since the 1960s. And Alan, you know, like me, I guess, did a lot of his writing, you know, during the pandemic where you couldn't easily travel or lockdown or whatever. But the availability of digital sources now is extraordinary, but we need to fight to keep them and to extend them because, you know, the National Library, of course, people here will have used Trove database, I imagine, and Australian newspapers online. It's running out of money and its software's ancient and all the rest of it. So, you know, write to your local member actually about things like digital sources because we need them, not just scholars, but all of us. I mean, they're part of our cultural capital and heritage, I guess, and they need to be supported by government. But yeah, look, otherwise, yes, it does draw on a lot of work I've done over a very long time, it has to be said. I mean, you know, a reader of this might be puzzled, why does, you know, New England keep creeping up? Well, I lived there for 7 years and read virtually every thesis in the cabinet, you know, going right back to the 1940s at the University of New England on the region's political history. So, and of course, I did my very earliest work on the Victorian Labor Party, on the early history of the Victorian Labor Party. So it does draw on much older work, but yes, you have to fill in those gaps. And the challenge is always, yeah, what to include and what to exclude so that's a coherent narrative. I mean, this isn't meant to be a reference book. It's meant to be something that someone will pick up, hopefully, and read as a you know, cover to cover, hopefully. It's very long. But, you know, that's the ambition that I had for it. It's not a textbook. And so that also meant, you know, really thinking about how it might work as story, I guess. I think there might, before we go, Tony, I think there was one up back here.
Thanks, Frank. I'm really looking forward to the written book. And I was particularly in the long cut, particularly before the war, and someone who's been involved in a lot of that participation. I was wondering if you had done anything in the book where they can say the painful society is that, and perhaps the society of labour lawyers.
Yeah, I've heard of Society of Labour Lawyers. I mean, the Fagans are a really important part of the you know, the political mix in that transformation of Australia in the 1960s. I mean, again, I've got Rose sitting here in front of me. You know, a critical modernising force. I go back to, I've just been writing something else this last week, and I go to that autumn lecture series, for instance, that the Fagans ran with John Button, ran the first of them with David Bennett. On the environment, 1965. This is you know, the same year that the Australian Conservation Foundation was formed. So they're an important modernising force in all sorts of ways. I don't talk about the Society of Local Lawyers in it. I mean, again, it's sort of one of those issues where there are all sorts of sort of features of politics and institutions and movements that, I'd love to have given more attention to, but you, in the end, kind of run out of space. But yeah, I think, again, I have certainly tried, as I said, to give a sense of the political activists, I guess, and political movements. I mean, yes, when I'm talking about the 70s, I talk about graffiti, I talk about punk music, even if only briefly, or in the 80s, the midnight oil. There's a source or a site of political socialisation of the young. So I think it's important to move beyond the kind of formal structures of politics and to think, in more broader cultural terms, I guess. Tony.
Yeah, Frank, I really appreciated you drawing that line from the radical liberals in the late 19th century to the Cain government, the liberal government. So putting libertarianism to one side, but just thinking about civil liberties, liberalism, which has always had a home in the ALP. What do you think of the present federal Labor Party and Labor government and the state Labor government here in Victoria in terms of those liberties and rights? So I'm thinking, as opposed to overwhelming government as much as through government protection of rights, but also the sort of things that Grace is looking about, such as co-ops and subsidiarity, government more beyond the state or alongside the state.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of its image, the Andrews government is less obviously in that kind of radical liberal image, perhaps, than say, Cain or Brax, maybe. But in substance, I suspect we are still dealing with that legacy and that heritage. Yeah, I mean, I think the emphasis certainly on the role of the state, particularly, I mentioned the whole infrastructure issue, on one hand, you could see that as kind of, a continuation, a development of the old, sort of protectionist status, David Syme, Alfred Deakin type tradition of the 19th century. On the other hand, it's incredibly ambitious. It goes a long way behind, setting up irrigation in Mildura, doesn't it? As Deakin was responsible for. So it may well be that we're seeing actually the crafting of quite a different sort of tradition and different political forms under the present government here. Within, obviously a very changed environment. I mean, the world's changed, it's been transformed in the last 7 or 8 years by the rise of populisms, by the pandemic, by a whole range of things. So we would expect to see adaptation of the kind that I've narrated for other periods. It's probably a bit early, and I certainly can't provide or don't provide a sustained analysis of the very recent sorts of developments going on. But I am very struck, I think, by the extent of innovation and experimentation going on at the state level, and Victoria is a prime example of that. As for the federal government, well, it's early days yet. We'll see, won't we? But they're operating obviously in a really constrained environment around, particularly that inflationary environment. It's very difficult for them. Yes.
Just a little curiosity. There was no Bandura branch until just immediately before the election, when someone from Thomastown, who died about 3 years ago.
This is 82.
Yes. Santos Querelo came to see me. I was a member of Principal, and someone else here might remember. It did me Bandura. So we started the branch especially for that election.
Is that right? The Bandura branch, yeah.
And in fact, the celebration of the win happened at the Bundy Hotel.
Oh yes, Bundy's, yes. I know.
We have the principal's office because they expected about 100 people and 400 of them.
Ah, right, okay.
And if you walked into the hotel, you saw 2 heads, about a sea of people, and the 2 heads were the Whitlams.
Ah, right. There you go. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Well, I just attended the 50th anniversary of the policy speech, the launch of the Camp 1972 campaign, which was in Bowman Hall in Sydney. And I can assure you that Whitlams still stand out in the crowd. Still. Yeah.
That was a fantastic speech. Thanks so much. You talk about
the positive role that Australians have towards the role of the state. I'd be interested to explore the dissonance with a low taxing country and having a positive role in the state. So is that mainly because particularly Labor parties have gone for welfare through work, we've had that tradition, or are there other factors, particularly where we are now in terms of the federal government needing to increase revenue to better provide decent services we need?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you're asking sort of, how to explain the contradiction between the two. I mean, we do know that the public tolerance of taxation shifted enormously over the years. So the polling of the 1980s basically told people like Hawke and Cain, no doubt, that the public wanted lower taxes. There was a very constrained political environment in the 80s, for instance, with regard to taxation, simply because poll after poll basically said people wouldn't have it. Now, the world's different now. The polling, as I understand, I haven't seen recent stuff, but the polling around taxation in the more recent past suggests that people are much more open to the idea of taxation in exchange for good services. So that's a really interesting shift over 40 years. One that interests me because obviously written on the 80s. And so, it was something I didn't fully realise actually when I wrote that book, was just how, negative the polling was around taxation. But that shifted. Now, why no one's been able to do the politics involved? Well, your guess is as good as mine. A very constrained, difficult media environment, which produces timidity in politicians these days. I don't know, but it's pretty clear that the politicians will not go to an election saying we're going to raise taxes, and the politics of that clearly do remain difficult. I don't have an answer for why that paradox or contradiction exists, to be perfectly honest.
Thanks very much for the report. I'm just wondering how you think feminists may review your work. I mean, we're here at Per Capita that are fighting for equality, and we've seen a lot of changes thanks to women, but there's also been a lot of criticism over the decades from feminists that women have been excluded from Australian history. Can you talk a little bit maybe about how you use a gender lens, if that is the case, and how you introduce the greater women that would define the great men?
Well, just the women who were political actors in their own right. Political history has a bad reputation around this because it often does look like great men. But yes, I guess I've tried to do two things around gender in the book. One of them is actually to explain the ways in which certain codes of masculinity operate in politics. I think it's a very important issue for us because they're still there, aren't they? Their traces are still with us in the debates, the intense debates we've had around the rather squalid nature of some aspects of our politics in recent years around issues of sexual assault and sexual harassment and so on. So I go right back deep into the 19th century to talk about the way those codes of masculinity work to exclude and to marginalise women. But I've also tried to, again, in the spirit of what I was talking about before, to talk about the spaces that women were able to use to participate in politics. And there I've got a picture of Adelaide Ironside, who figures in the book, a Republican. Who's heard of Adelaide Ironside? Says it, yeah. Okay, so a Republican of the early 1850s, an artist, a poet, that doesn't figure, does she really, still in the pantheon of the history of Australian nationalism or republic, but fascinating figure. Moved in the same circles. In fact, her kind of mentor was John Lang, a very famous colonial figure, but associated with figures like Daniel Dennehy, coined the term bunyip aristocracy, and the young Henry Parkes, in his Republican phase, and was a regarded, a respected figure, and we find at that time women involved in politics through petitioning, through participation in public meetings. We shouldn't somehow equate women's involvement in politics as being conditioned by whether or not they had the vote, because most people didn't have the vote for much of the 19th century in Australia, certainly until about the 1860s. So I've tried to find, where are those spaces for women's participation in the colonial period, and of course, taking that story through into the 20th century, looking at the difficulties that women have had in finding a place within the party system, despite the relatively early enfranchisement of women in Australia by international standards. But it didn't have an appreciable effect on women's parliamentary representation. They were, of course, not legally entitled in most jurisdictions in Australia to stand for Parliament until after 1915. So the vote came earlier than the right to stand, except for South Australia and the Commonwealth. But more generally, of course, political parties have often been very unsympathetic environments for women, and some would argue remain so today, although I think there are probably distinctions to be made between the parties these days, I would have thought. I don't think that's a partisan comment, is it? I would have thought Labor's done rather better in this field than the coalition, both Nationals and Liberals, actually.
I'd like to make a comment, and I'm building on Alison's tax sort of dilemma between individual and collective responsibility that you mentioned. I think politically, the political history has reformed our cultural priorities in a sense. So if I think about 11 years of Howard, and then things like robo-debt. And so we've become quite selective around what collective responsibility, we have. And I think that has been formed by the cultural and political mix. Last night there were 4,000 children in detention, 50% of them were Indigenous. And, we have a legacy caseload of visas that, for a decade. No one seems to politically is untouchable. We have some of the most vulnerable. It took 4 years for a Liberal government to actually own its promise to make sure that women, the fastest growing homelessness group, could actually access superannuation of men until they were absolutely forced. So I think it's quite selective, and I'm interested in just your view of just those pockets of history that have selected that cultural mix and what we're prepared to be collective about.
Perhaps we need to focus more on the phrase in Hancock, the individual rights between, the individual, that focus on the individual, because, I suppose the vision of government that's been quite dominant in Australia has been government at the service of often individuals and families. Now, that can take an egalitarian direction, which I think you could argue it did roughly between the 1940s and probably about the 1970s, I guess. I mean, we know from the figures that Australia, like most developed countries, I think in that period became a more equal place. Now, clearly, things changed after that, and I guess, we had the formation of a kind of, I suppose, a neoliberal citizen, really, who finds their fulfilment, who pursues their interests through the acquisition of individual property. The property market itself is a great example of this, and superannuation, the way it's evolved, has also got massive concessions, obviously, around that, which has led to all sorts of intergenerational inequities. So, I think the particular form, perhaps, that the neoliberal turn in Australia has taken since the 1980s has accentuated some aspects of the political culture that make it produce rather poor material for looking after the most vulnerable people, I think, would be the way I put it. I just think that if you basically say that the goal of government is the greatest good for the greatest number, that classic utilitarian or Benthamite idea, that's great if you belong to the greatest number, right? Fantastic, But if you don't belong to the greatest number, if you're at the margins, if your voice is muted, if you have, you lack wealth, you lack power, not such a great political culture. And I do wonder whether that's one of the big stories of the pandemic, actually. I wonder if that's one of the big stories of the pandemic, the way in which we look terrific, really. Let's face it, we did a fantastic job of the greatest good for the greatest number stuff, didn't we? I mean, we did that pretty well, I reckon, but not so good. Some of those more marginalised people, some of those poorer people, some of those people with less power. and young people.
Thank you, Frank. I'm concerned that maybe you mentioned this before, I'm concerned that we're not listening very clearly to the voices of young people who speak with clarity and with the vision, like Hans Christian Andersen's little boy who called out that the emperor was actually naked. We have a lot of those voices, and often they're overwhelmed by the voices of older people, people who say, well, they don't know anything, or people who are extremists or whatever. But have we progressed in the way of listening carefully to these voices and including them in decisions for the future? Because they don't tend to bring along the baggage of older people.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of my very best students works in children's history and had one with this book. So I was very conscious of wanting to write about the political activities of younger people. Again, in general history, it's patchy, but I certainly talk, for instance, about the role of school children and younger people in anti-Hanson protest in the late 90s, of which that's an example. Again, another interesting pandemic tale, I would have thought, because on the eve of the pandemic, when the school strikes around climate change, there was a real sense, I think, of younger people's voices really being out there in the public sphere, and particularly, I think, around those environmental issues, which, for very obvious reasons, young people are very engaged with. I think that the pandemic had a dreadful impact, actually, in blanketing those voices. I think children were effectively silenced in a lot of ways. And of course, many have come out of the experience. It's been a very negative one for them, a very difficult one for them. So, yeah, I think it's very important that when we do political history, we keep younger people in view. They are political actors. They are in a very ambiguous place, aren't they, in the political order? Because we often see them, I think, as something less than full citizens. And that perhaps again comes back to this kind of equation of the right to vote with somehow a full participation in the political nation. But they are a very important part of I think, the story of the country and certainly of its politics. I mean, we've had periods in which, in the post-World War II period, it was a population very slanted towards young. I don't have the particular figure in my head, but very, disproportionate number of people in Australia in the post-World War II period were young people. And so if we talk about the politics of the post-World War II period without considering the role of young people in that, we're going to miss a fair bit of the story. It's the main game. Yeah. Done. Well, thank you for the nice questions. Really terrific.
Thank you.
So yes, thank you very much for a really interesting talk. And I just want to go home and read the book now. But unfortunately, I've got other places to be until 9 o'clock tonight. So I'll fall asleep with it in my hands. Terrific conversation today. Thank you all for coming.